The woman in the black veil stepped off the afternoon stagecoach into Independence, Missouri, on a sweltering July day in 1873, and every soul on Main Street stopped what they were doing to stare at the mysterious figure who moved like a ghost through the dusty air. Victoria Keller kept her chin high despite the weight of their gazes, her gloved hands clutching a worn leather bag that contained everything she owned in this world. The veil hung from the brim of her hat, obscuring her face completely, a barrier of delicate lace between her and a world that had proven itself cruel. She had traveled for 3 weeks to reach this place, answering an advertisement for a seamstress position at the general store. And now that she stood on this unfamiliar street with the afternoon sun beating down mercilessly, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The general store stood at the corner of Main and Oak, a weathered building with a hand-painted sign that read, "Morrison's General Goods." Victoria pushed through the door, grateful for the relative coolness inside and the dimmer light that made her veil less conspicuous. An elderly woman behind the counter looked up from her ledger, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of the veiled stranger. "I am Victoria Keller," she said, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "I wrote to you about the seamstress position." "Oh yes, dear." The woman's expression softened with recognition. "I'm Martha Morrison. We've been expecting you, though I must say we didn't know about." She gestured vaguely toward the veil. "I hope it will not be a problem." Victoria straightened her shoulders. "I assure you, my hands work perfectly well and my eyesight is excellent. The veil is merely a personal preference." Martha studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Well, let's see your work then. I've got some mending that needs doing." For the next hour, Victoria demonstrated her skills with needle and thread, her fingers moving with practiced precision as she repaired a torn dress, reinforced buttons on a work shirt, and even managed some decorative embroidery on a handkerchief. Martha watched carefully, occasionally asking questions about techniques and experience, and by the time Victoria finished, the older woman was smiling. "You're hired," Martha said. "The room upstairs isn't much, but it's clean and the roof doesn't leak. Meals are your own responsibility, but I'll give you a fair wage. Start tomorrow morning at 7. Relief flooded through Victoria's chest. "Thank you, Mrs. Morrison. You will not regret this." The room upstairs was indeed small, barely large enough for a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk for her belongings, but it was hers, and that was more than she had dared to hope for. She unpacked her few possessions, carefully folding her 2 spare dresses, arranging her sewing supplies, and placing a small tintype photograph on the washstand. The photograph showed a young woman with long dark hair and an unblemished face, laughing at something outside the frame. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from another life entirely. Victoria removed her hat and veil only after she had hung a blanket over the single window, plunging the room into darkness. Even alone, she found it difficult to expose her face, as if the scars themselves were shameful secrets that must be hidden from the world. She traced the raised tissue that ran from her left temple down across her cheek to her jaw, remembering the fire that had consumed her family's home in Ohio 2 years ago. The fire that had taken her parents and her younger brother, and left her alive, but forever marked. She had spent months recovering in a charity hospital, enduring the stares and whispered comments of nurses and other patients. When she finally healed enough to leave, she found that doors once open to her were now firmly closed. No one wanted to employ a scarred woman, no matter how skilled she might be. The veil had been her solution, a way to move through the world without constantly confronting the pity and revulsion in people's eyes. Victoria's first weeks in Independence passed quietly. She worked diligently at the general store, arriving early and staying late to complete her tasks. Word of her skills spread quickly through the town, and soon women were bringing her their finest dresses to alter, their wedding gowns to repair, their children's Sunday clothes to mend. She spoke little, kept to herself, and never removed her veil, even when the summer heat made the fabric cling to her face uncomfortably. The other women in town found her fascinating and unsettling in equal measure. They whispered theories about what lay beneath the veil, each speculation more dramatic than the last. Some said she was hideously deformed, others that she was a famous beauty hiding from a violent husband, still others that she was foreign royalty traveling incognito. Victoria heard the whispers and ignored them, focusing on her work and the slowly growing weight of coins in her savings. It was on a Saturday morning in early August when Preston Xavier first walked into Morrison's general store. Victoria sat in the corner designated for her sewing, working on a complicated alteration to a silk dress, when the bell above the door chimed. She glanced up briefly, noting a tall man in dusty work clothes, his face tanned and weathered by the sun, his dark hair slightly too long and falling into his eyes. He moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin, his boots leaving faint tracks of dirt on the swept floor. "Morning, Martha," he called out, his voice a deep rumble that carried easily through the store. "I need supplies for the ranch. Got a list here." "Preston Xavier, you track mud into my store every single time," Martha scolded, but there was affection in her tone. "One of these days, I'm going to make you take those boots off at the door." He laughed, a warm sound that made something in Victoria's chest tighten unexpectedly. "Then I'd track dirt in with my socks instead. Can't be helped when you live 10 miles out on a cattle ranch." Victoria bent her head over her sewing, trying to focus on the tiny stitches, but she found herself listening to the conversation as Martha gathered Preston's supplies. He owned a ranch west of town, apparently one of the larger spreads in the area. He came into town every couple of weeks for provisions, always friendly and courteous, well liked by everyone. Martha was asking about his cattle, about the summer heat and the grazing conditions, and he answered patiently while leaning against the counter. "I see you've got help now," Preston said, and Victoria's hands stilled on the fabric. "Heard there was a new seamstress in town." "Yes, that's Victoria. Best needlework I've ever seen. Victoria, dear, come meet Preston Xavier. He owns the Double X Ranch." Victoria wanted to refuse, to keep her head down and continue working, but she knew that would be impossibly rude. She set aside the silk dress carefully and rose, smoothing her skirts before approaching the counter. Through the veil, she could see Preston more clearly now. He was perhaps 30 years old, with strong features and observant gray eyes that studied her with open curiosity but no apparent judgment. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat politely, "pleasure to meet you, Mr. Xavier." She kept her voice even, professional. "I might have need of a seamstress myself," he said. "Got a shirt that tore right across the shoulder and I'm no good with a needle. Would you have time to mend it? Of course. You can leave it here with Mrs. Morrison and I will have it ready in 2 days. Much appreciated." He smiled, the expression reaching his eyes and creating small lines at the corners. "Welcome to independence." She nodded, then retreated to her corner, acutely aware that he watched her for a moment before returning to his conversation with Martha. Her heart was beating faster than it should, and she scolded herself silently. She had not come to independence to notice men, especially not successful ranchers who would surely want nothing to do with a veiled woman once they learned the truth about her face. Preston Xavier proved to be a regular customer over the following weeks. He seemed to have an endless supply of torn clothing, shirts with missing buttons, trousers that needed hemming. Each time he came to the store, he would greet Victoria politely, sometimes lingering to ask about her work or comment on the weather. He never asked about the veil, never stared at it the way others did, and his manner remained consistently respectful and friendly. "That man is sweet on you," Martha said one afternoon after Preston had left with a mended jacket. Victoria shook her head. "He is simply being kind. Preston Xavier doesn't bring mending to town this often just to be kind," Martha said knowingly. "He's got a housekeeper who can sew well enough for basic repairs. He's making excuses to see you. Then he is wasting his time." Victoria's voice came out sharper than she intended. "I am not available for courtship." Martha looked at her sadly. "Everyone deserves happiness, dear. Even people who think they don't." That night, alone in her small room, Victoria allowed herself to think about Preston Xavier. She thought about his kind gray eyes, his easy smile, the way he spoke to her as if the veil were perfectly normal and unremarkable. She thought about what it might be like to accept his attention, to allow herself to hope for something beyond solitary work and lonely evenings. Then she removed her veil in the darkness and traced the scars on her face, and she knew that hope was a luxury she could not afford. September brought cooler weather and the first hints of autumn color to the trees around Independence. The store grew busier as people prepared for winter, ordering fabrics for warm clothes and bringing repairs that had been put off during the busy summer months. Victoria worked from dawn until well after dark most days, grateful for the distraction of constant labor. Preston continued his regular visits, and despite her best efforts to remain distant, Victoria found herself looking forward to seeing him. He had a gift for conversation, sharing stories about ranch life that made her smile despite herself. He told her about a particularly stubborn cow who kept escaping her pen, about training a new horse who thought he was smarter than his rider, about the challenges of managing ranch hands who would rather play cards than work. "You should come out and see the ranch sometime," he said one afternoon in late September. "It's beautiful country, especially this time of year." "That would not be appropriate," Victoria said, though part of her yearned to accept. Martha could come too, make it a proper social call. "She's been friends with my housekeeper for years. We could have Sunday dinner." "Mr. Xavier, I appreciate your kindness, but I must decline." He was quiet for a moment, then said gently, "You don't ever have to hide from me, you know." The words struck something deep inside her, and she looked up sharply. "I do not know what you mean. The veil. Whatever reason you have for wearing it, whatever you're protecting yourself from, you don't need to protect yourself from me." His voice was earnest, his eyes meeting hers through the lace barrier. "I'd like to know you, Victoria, the real you." She stood abruptly, her sewing falling to the floor. "You should collect your mending, Mr. Xavier. Good day." She fled to the back room before he could respond, her heart pounding and her hands shaking. She heard Martha's voice murmuring something, then the sound of the door closing as Preston left. Victoria pressed her palms against her hot cheeks, feeling the rough texture of the scars beneath her fingertips. He didn't understand. He couldn't possibly understand what he was asking. Martha found her there 10 minutes later, sitting on a crate in the storage room, still trembling. The older woman sat down beside her with a sigh. "He didn't mean to upset you, dear. He wants something I cannot give him. He wants to know you. That doesn't seem like such a terrible thing." Victoria shook her head. "He thinks he wants to know me, but if he saw what I hide, he would feel only pity or disgust. I have seen it too many times before." "Preston Xavier isn't like most men," Martha said firmly. "He's good and decent and true. His parents raised him right before they passed. He's been running that ranch alone for 5 years now, working himself near to death, and he's never once complained or asked for sympathy. If he's taken an interest in you, it's because he sees something worth knowing, veil or not. My face was burned in a fire, Victoria said quietly. The scars are extensive. I wear the veil so that I might move through the world without constant reminder of what I have lost. Please do not ask me to remove it. Martha took her hand and squeezed gently. I won't ask that, dear, but I will say this. True connection between two people isn't about what's on the outside. Preston's interested in who you are, not what you look like. Maybe you should give him a chance to prove that. Victoria wanted to argue, to explain all the reasons why that was impossible, but she was too tired and too confused. She simply nodded and returned to her work, trying not to think about gray eyes and a gentle voice saying, "Let me see the real you." Preston didn't come to the store for 2 weeks after that conversation, and Victoria told herself she was relieved. Without his presence, she could focus entirely on her work, on the steady rhythm of needle and thread, on the satisfaction of transforming damaged cloth into something whole again. But the store seemed dimmer without him, and she caught herself listening for the sound of his boots on the floor, the rumble of his voice greeting Martha. It was a Thursday afternoon in early October when everything changed. Victoria was alone in the store, Martha having stepped out to visit a sick friend when 3 men pushed through the door. She knew immediately that something was wrong. Their movements were too quick, too aggressive, and they smelled of whiskey even from across the room. "Well, well," one of them said, a thin man with a scar across his nose. "Store's open, but nobody's home except the ghost lady." "I can help you gentlemen," Victoria said, proud that her voice remained steady. "What do you need? What's under that veil?" another one asked, stepping closer. "You hiding something good or something ugly? That is none of your concern. Please make your purchases or leave." The third man, bigger than the others and clearly the leader, moved behind the counter. "Maybe we'll take what we want without paying. What's a veiled woman going to do about it?" Fear shot through Victoria's veins, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Stealing is unwise. Mrs. Morrison will return shortly, and the sheriff's office is just down the street." "Then maybe we should make this quick," the leader said, grabbing a handful of coins from the cash box. His companions began stuffing goods into their pockets, working quickly and efficiently. This wasn't their first robbery. Victoria's mind raced. If she ran for help, they might escape, or worse, they might destroy the store in anger. If she stayed, she was at their mercy. She was considering her options when the thin man with the scarred nose approached her. "I want to see what you're hiding," he said, reaching for her veil. She jerked back, but he was faster, his fingers catching the fabric and yanking hard. The veil tore free along with her hat, and suddenly her face was exposed to the afternoon light streaming through the windows. The man stumbled backward with a curse. "Jesus," he breathed. "Look at her face." The others turned to stare, and Victoria saw the familiar expressions. Shock, disgust, morbid fascination. She stood frozen, exposed and vulnerable as they gaped at her scars. "That's the ugliest thing I ever saw," the leader said, and his words hit her like physical blows. The door flew open with such force that it crashed against the wall. Preston Xavier stood in the entrance, and the expression on his face was terrifying. He took in the scene instantly. The men with their pockets full of stolen goods, the open cash box, and Victoria standing there with her face exposed and tears streaming down her cheeks. "Get out," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Get out now, or I swear to God, I'll break every bone in your bodies." The 3 men looked at Preston, at the fury radiating from him, and apparently decided that their stolen goods weren't worth facing him. They bolted for the door, pushing past him and running down the street. Preston let them go, his attention immediately turning to Victoria. She had collapsed onto her chair, her hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. All the strength she had maintained during the confrontation had dissolved the moment she was safe, leaving her raw and broken. She heard Preston's footsteps approaching, felt him kneel beside her chair. "Victoria," he said softly, "are you hurt? Did they harm you?" She couldn't answer, couldn't stop crying, couldn't bear the thought of him seeing her like this. She kept her hands pressed to her face, trying desperately to hide the scars even though it was far too late. "May I?" he asked, his hands hovering near her wrists. She shook her head frantically. "Please do not look at me, please." "I'm going to touch your hands now," he said gently. "I won't force you, but I'd like to see if you're injured." His fingers wrapped around her wrists, warm and strong and infinitely careful. He didn't pull her hands away, just held them, his thumbs making small circles on her skin. She gradually became aware that he was speaking, a low stream of comforting words. "You're safe now. I've got you. Nobody's going to hurt you. You're safe." Slowly, so slowly, she lowered her hands. Her face was still wet with tears, her eyes swollen from crying, and the scars stood out starkly against her flushed skin. Preston looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time without the veil between them. His expression didn't change to disgust or pity. Instead, his eyes softened with something that looked like tenderness. He reached up carefully, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and gently brushed tears from her right cheek with his thumb. "There you are," he said quietly. "The real you." "I am hideous," she whispered. "You can see why I hide." "I see a woman who survived something terrible," he said. "I see strength and courage. I see someone beautiful." She laughed bitterly. "You are lying to be kind. I've never lied in my life, and I'm not about to start now." He stood, then held out his hand to her. "Come on, let's get you some water and find your veil." He retrieved the torn veil from where it had fallen, examining it with a frown. "This is pretty badly damaged. Do you have another?" "Yes, in my room." "I'll walk you up. Then I'm going to find the sheriff and report those men." Martha returned while Preston was helping Victoria upstairs, and by the time they came back down, the older woman had heard the whole story from a neighbor who had seen the thieves run from the store. She fussed over Victoria, made her tea, insisted she sit down and rest, and sent Preston off to make his report to the sheriff. "Those Burke brothers," Martha said angrily. "They've been trouble since they rode into town last month. Sheriff should have run them out long ago. Did they take much?" Victoria asked. "Some coins, some supplies. Nothing that can't be replaced." Martha patted her hand. "I'm just grateful you weren't hurt worse." Preston returned an hour later to report that the sheriff was organizing a posse to track down the Burke brothers. He had also, without being asked, replaced the coins they had stolen from his own pocket, refusing to accept repayment. "I want to talk to Victoria," he said to Martha. "Alone, if that's acceptable." Martha looked at Victoria, who nodded reluctantly. The older woman disappeared into the back room, leaving them in the growing dimness of late afternoon. Preston pulled up a chair and sat facing her. "How are you feeling?" "Ashamed," she admitted. "You saw me at my weakest." "I saw you facing down 3 thieves with more courage than most men could muster," he corrected. "I saw you standing tall even when you were terrified. There's no shame in that. You saw my face." "I did." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You told me once that you didn't know what I meant when I said you didn't need to hide from me. Do you understand now?" She touched the veil she wore, a different one, slightly heavier than her usual choice. "You have seen the worst. I suppose there is nothing left to hide." "That's not what I mean, and you know it." His voice was gentle but firm. "Victoria, I've been coming to this store for weeks now, finding excuses to see you, to talk to you, to hear your voice and your thoughts. I've been courting you in my clumsy way, hoping you might eventually feel the same interest in me that I feel in you. Your face being scarred doesn't change any of that." Her heart was pounding so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. "Why? Why what? Why would you want someone like me? You could have any woman in Independence, any woman in the whole territory. You are successful and kind and good. Why would you choose someone damaged?" "You're not damaged," he said firmly. "You're scarred, yes, but so am I. Mine just don't show on my face." He stood and offered his hand again. "Will you come to the ranch? Let me show you something." She shouldn't agree. She should maintain her distance, protect her heart, remember all the reasons why Hope was dangerous. But his hand was steady and his eyes were kind, and she found herself taking his hand and standing. "I will need to tell Mrs. Morrison where I am going." "Of course." They took Preston's wagon, the evening air cooling rapidly as they left town behind. The ranch was indeed 10 miles west, following a road that wound through increasingly beautiful country. Rolling hills covered in autumn grass, stands of trees beginning to turn gold and red, the vast dome of the sky stretching endlessly above them. Preston pointed out landmarks, told her about the land, kept up an easy stream of conversation that required little response from her. The Double X Ranch was larger than she had imagined. A sturdy 2-story house with a wide porch, barns and corrals, bunkhouses for the ranch hands, and cattle dotting the distant fields. As they pulled up to the house, a woman emerged from the front door, wiping her hands on her apron. "Preston Xavier, you didn't tell me you were bringing company," she scolded, but she was smiling. "I haven't got anything fancy prepared for supper." "This is Victoria Keller," Preston said, helping Victoria down from the wagon. "Victoria, this is Sarah Mitchell, my housekeeper and the person who actually keeps this ranch running." Sarah was perhaps 50, with graying hair and a warm, open face. She looked curiously at Victoria's veil but didn't comment on it, simply offered her hand and a genuine smile. "Any friend of Preston's is welcome here. Come in, come in. I'll put coffee on." The inside of the house was comfortable and well-maintained, with furniture that was sturdy rather than fancy and windows that let in the fading light. Sarah bustled off to the kitchen while Preston led Victoria to a small sitting room. "Wait here for just a moment," he said. "I want to show you something." He returned carrying a wooden box, old and battered, and sat beside her on the sofa. He opened it carefully, revealing a stack of letters, some photographs, and various small objects. He sifted through until he found what he was looking for and held it up. It was a photograph of a young couple, the woman holding a baby. The man in the photograph had Preston's features, unmistakably his father. But it was the woman Victoria stared at. The left side of her face was marked with what looked like a large birthmark, covering her cheek and part of her neck. "My mother," Preston said quietly. "She was born with that mark, and people treated her terribly because of it, called her cursed, said she was marked by the devil. She grew up believing she was unworthy of love or happiness." Victoria touched the photograph gently. "What changed, my father?" "He met her when he came west to start his ranch, saw past what everyone else saw, and fell in love with who she was. They married within 6 months and had 30 years together before the fever took them both." He set the photograph down carefully. "My mother taught me that what matters is what's in here." He touched his chest. "Not what's out here," he gestured to his face. "She was fortunate to find your father, and I'm fortunate that she taught me to see people the way he saw her." He turned to face Victoria fully. "I've been watching you for months now. I've seen how hard you work, how kind you are to the women who bring you their sewing, how you never gossip or complain. I've heard your laugh when something genuinely amuses you. I've noticed that you always give Martha back the extra change when she accidentally overpays you. I know you send money to the orphanage in Kansas City every month, even though you don't have much to spare. How did you know about that? Martha might have mentioned it. The point is, I know you, Victoria, not your face. You. And I am asking you to give me a chance to prove that your scars don't matter to me. She wanted to believe him. Oh, how she wanted to believe him. But fear was a powerful force, and it whispered all the ways this could end in pain. I do not know if I can. Then let's start small, he said. Will you have dinner with me tonight? Here with Sarah as chaperone, nothing improper, just dinner and conversation, my veil. Wear it if it makes you comfortable, or don't. Either way, I just want your company. Sarah called them to dinner then, and Victoria found herself sitting at a table laden with beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie. Sarah kept the conversation flowing easily, telling stories about the ranch and the hands who worked there, asking Victoria about her sewing and her journey to independence. It felt strange and wonderful to sit at a family table again, to be part of this small community even briefly. As the evening wore on, Victoria felt some of her fear beginning to ease. Preston was exactly as he had always been, kind, attentive, respectful. He never pushed her to remove the veil, never stared at where he knew the scars lay beneath the fabric. He simply talked with her, laughed with her, shared his life with her. It was full dark when he drove her back to town, the wagon creaking peacefully and the stars brilliant overhead. They rode in comfortable silence for a while before Preston spoke. I meant what I said earlier. I want to court you properly if you'll allow it. Sunday drives, dinners, getting to know each other better. No pressure, no expectations beyond spending time together. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with her fear and her growing feelings for this man. Finally, she said, I am afraid of being hurt. I know. I'm a little afraid too. She looked at him in surprise. You, why? Because I care about you, and caring about someone means risking pain. What if you decide you don't want a rancher who smells like cattle and works from dawn to dark? What if you meet someone else, someone better suited to you? What if I'm not enough? He glanced at her with a slight smile. See, fear works both ways. I cannot imagine you not being enough for anyone. Then maybe you can imagine giving us a chance. She took a deep breath, then nodded. Yes. I would like that. His smile in the darkness was beautiful. Good. Then I'll pick you up Sunday afternoon if that suits you. Over the following weeks, Preston courted Victoria with a patience and steadiness that gradually wore away at her defenses. He took her on drives through the countryside, showing her the land he loved. He brought her to church socials, introducing her proudly to his friends and neighbors, daring anyone with his presence to comment negatively on her veil. He sat with her in the garden behind the general store during her lunch breaks, sharing sandwiches and stories. Slowly, carefully, Victoria began to believe that perhaps this could be real. She found herself laughing more often, looking forward to each visit, thinking about him during the long hours of sewing. She learned about his dreams for the ranch, his hope to expand the cattle operation and maybe start breeding horses. She learned that he loved to raid, that his favorite meal was roast chicken, that he had a terrible singing voice but hummed constantly while working. In turn, she shared pieces of herself that she had kept locked away. She told him about her childhood in Ohio, about her parents and brother, about the fire that had changed everything. She told him about the hospital, about the long, painful recovery, about learning to live behind a veil. He listened to all of it with complete attention, never interrupting, offering comfort when the memories made her cry. It was late November, with the first real cold settling into Missouri, when Preston asked her to remove the veil. They were sitting in his parlor, Sarah having left them alone after serving tea, the fire crackling warmly in the hearth. Preston had been quiet all evening, and Victoria could sense he had something on his mind. "Victoria," he finally said, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to know you can say no." Her heart began to pound. "What is it?" "I'm in love with you." The words were simple and direct, and they hit her like a thunderbolt. "I have been for a while now. I want to marry you, build a life with you, wake up beside you every morning for the rest of my days. But before I officially ask, before I offer you a ring, I need you to trust me enough to show me your face." "You have seen it," she whispered. "In a moment of trauma and fear, yes. But I'm asking you to choose to show me now, to trust that I mean what I've been telling you all these months." He reached out and took her hand. "I'm not asking because I need to see your scars to decide if I can accept them. I'm asking because I need you to believe that I can accept them. That I already do accept them. Let me see the real you, Victoria, not in fear or shame, but in trust." Tears welled in her eyes. This was the moment she had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. Her hands shook as she reached up to unfasten the veil, and Preston waited, not moving, barely breathing. The veil fell away, and she sat before him completely exposed, the firelight illuminating every ridge and valley of scar tissue. The burns had been severe, leaving her left side marked from temple to jaw, the skin pulled tight and shiny in places, rough and textured in others. Her left eye had been affected too, the skin around it puckered, though her vision remained intact. Preston looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, that same warm smile that had made her heart flutter from the beginning, and reached out to cup her scarred cheek in his palm. "Beautiful," he said softly, "just as I knew you would be. Preston, you do not have to say things you do not mean. I mean it with everything I am." He stroked his thumb gently across the scarred skin. "You are beautiful to me, Victoria. Your strength, your kindness, your courage, yes. But also this face that shows what you survived, what you overcame. This face that belongs to the woman I love." She was crying openly now, but these were different tears. These were tears of relief, of joy, of a hope so powerful it terrified her. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have tried tried to protect myself, but I cannot help it." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away, and kissed her. It was gentle and sweet, his lips warm against hers, his hand still cradling her scarred cheek. When they parted, he was smiling. "Victoria Keller, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and she felt something inside her chest unfold like a flower opening to the sun. She was loved. Scars and all, fears and all, she was loved completely. They were married in early December, in a small ceremony at the Independence Church with Martha and Sarah as witnesses. Victoria wore a dress of pale blue silk that she had sewn herself, and for the wedding, she chose not to wear a veil. It was time, she decided, to stop hiding. If she was to be Preston's wife, to build a life with him, she needed to face the world as she truly was. The townspeople stared, of course. Some looked away quickly, uncomfortable with her appearance. But others smiled genuinely, wishing them happiness, and Victoria realized that Preston's acceptance had given her the courage to weather any reaction. She was no longer alone in facing the world's judgment. The ranch became her home, and she threw herself into making it truly theirs. She sewed curtains for the windows, planted an herb garden near the kitchen door, organized the chaotic storage rooms. Sarah welcomed her warmly, clearly delighted to have another woman around, and taught her all the skills necessary for managing a ranch household. Preston was a devoted husband, patient and loving, always conscious of her fears without treating her as fragile. He included her in decisions about the ranch, valued her opinions, encouraged her to continue her sewing work if she wished. Several women from town continued to bring her their mending and alterations, and she was grateful for the work that let her maintain some independence. Their physical relationship developed slowly, Victoria's insecurities requiring time and reassurance. But Preston never rushed her, never showed anything but desire and love for her body, scars included. He would trace the marks on her face with tender fingers, kiss the damaged skin, tell her she was beautiful until she began to believe it herself. Winter passed into spring, and Victoria found herself settling into happiness she had never imagined possible. She and Preston fell into comfortable rhythms, working together to manage the ranch, sitting together in the evenings reading or talking, making love in their big bed upstairs while the wind howled outside. She learned to ride a horse, to identify different cattle breeds, to make Sarah's special biscuit recipe. It was on a warm June evening, a year after they had met, that Victoria realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks but had been afraid to hope, afraid to believe that this too might be possible for her. But the signs were unmistakable, and when she told Preston, his joy was instantaneous and overwhelming. "A baby," he breathed, pulling her into his arms. "Victoria, we're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" "Happy. I'm beyond happy. I'm terrified and elated and grateful all at once." He kissed her thoroughly. "You've given me everything I didn't know I needed." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Victoria bloomed with impending motherhood. Preston was impossibly protective, trying to prevent her from doing any work that he deemed too strenuous, until she finally had to remind him that she was pregnant, not ill. But his care came from love, and she found it endearing even when it was excessive. Their son was born in February of 1875, during a snowstorm that trapped them at the ranch for 3 days afterward. Victoria labored for hours with Sarah attending her and Preston pacing anxiously downstairs. When she finally held the baby in her arms, tiny and perfect and loudly protesting his arrival into the world, she wept with a joy so profound it felt almost holy. "He's perfect," Preston whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with one gentle finger. "Absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas, after Preston's father, and he proved to be a healthy, vigorous infant with his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes. Preston was a devoted father, taking his turn walking the floor with a crying baby, changing diapers without complaint, spending hours simply watching Thomas sleep. Victoria watched her husband with their son and fell in love with him all over again. This man who had looked past her scars to see her heart, who had courted her with patience and married her with pride, who now cradled their child with such tenderness. She had been so certain that her life was over when the fire scarred her, so convinced that she would never have love or family or happiness. How wrong she had been. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Preston's careful management and hard work paid off in expanding herds and improved breeding stock. They hired more hands, built a new barn, purchased additional grazing land. Victoria continued her sewing, now making clothes for Thomas and taking on special projects that challenged her skills. She no longer wore a veil except on the rare occasions when strangers came to the ranch, and even then, it was more from habit than necessity. Preston's love had given her the confidence to face the world without hiding, and while she still sometimes saw stares or uncomfortable reactions, they no longer had the power to wound her deeply. 2 years after Thomas was born, Victoria gave birth to twin girls, Emma and Grace. The birth was harder than Thomas's had been, and for a few frightening hours, the doctor worried they might lose Victoria. But she fought through with the same strength that had carried her through the fire and its aftermath. And when it was over, she held two perfect daughters and felt her heart expand impossibly further. Preston cried when he saw the twins, overcome with gratitude and love. "3 children," he said wonderingly. "Victoria, you've given me 3 beautiful children." "We made them together," she reminded him, laughing weakly. The ranch house rang with children's laughter now, with the chaos of toys scattered across the floor and small voices calling for attention. Thomas proved to be a gentle older brother, protective of his baby sisters and eager to help care for them. Preston built an addition onto the house, expanding the upstairs to accommodate the growing family, and Victoria sewed tiny dresses and shirts until her fingers ached. Years passed in a blur of busy happiness. The children grew, the ranch prospered, Preston's hair began to gray at the temples. Victoria watched her face age in the mirror, new lines appearing around her eyes and mouth, and found that the scars bothered her less with each passing year. They were simply part of her now, marks of survival and strength rather than symbols of loss. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books and horses in equal measure. Emma was wild and adventurous, always climbing trees or chasing cattle. Grace was gentle and artistic, spending hours drawing pictures of everything around her. Preston loved them all fiercely, taught them to ride and rope and manage the ranch, but also encouraged their individual interests and dreams. "I want them to choose their own paths," he told Victoria one evening as they watched the children play in the yard. "If Thomas wants to run the ranch, wonderful. If he wants to be a teacher or a lawyer, that's wonderful too. Same for the girls. They should have choices." "You're a good father," Victoria said, leaning against him. "I'm trying to be the father my dad was to me, and you're an amazing mother." She smiled, thinking about how impossible this life had seemed when she first stepped off that stagecoach in Independence. How certain she had been that happiness was forever beyond her reach. How wrong she had been. Martha grew older and eventually retired, selling the general store to a young couple from Kansas City. She moved into a small house near the church and spent her days visiting friends and knitting blankets for babies. She visited the ranch often, delighting in watching Victoria's children grow, reminding everyone that she had known from the start that Preston and Victoria were meant for each other. Sarah eventually married a widower from town, a kindly farmer who had been courting her for years. She moved to his farm but remained close with the Xavier family, attending every birthday party and holiday celebration. Preston hired a younger woman to help with the housework, though Victoria managed most of it herself, having learned to run the large household efficiently. When Thomas was 10 and the twins were 8, Victoria discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was a surprise, as she had assumed her childbearing years were behind her. But it was a welcome surprise, and Preston was thrilled at the prospect of another child. Their youngest son was born in the spring of 1887, a robust baby they named Henry after Victoria's father. Thomas was old enough now to be a real helper with the baby, and the twins treated Henry like a living doll, constantly wanting to hold him and play with him. Victoria, now in her late 30s, found this pregnancy and birth harder to recover from than the previous ones, but Preston was there every step of the way, taking over household duties and caring for the older children while she regained her strength. His love remained as constant and solid as it had been from the beginning, perhaps deeper now with years of shared life behind them. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Preston became known throughout the territory as a fair employer and skilled rancher, and young men came from miles around hoping to work for him. He treated his hands with respect, paid them fairly, and several times helped them start their own small operations when they were ready to move on. Victoria became involved with the church women's group, using her sewing skills to help make clothes for families in need. At first, she had been nervous about joining, worried about how the women would react to her scarred face. But they welcomed her warmly, valuing her skills and her kindness, and she formed genuine friendships for the first time since leaving Ohio. As the children grew into teenagers, the house remained full of noise and activity. Thomas showed real aptitude for ranching and began taking on more responsibilities, working alongside his father and learning the business from the ground up. Emma declared her intention to become a teacher and threw herself into her studies with characteristic intensity. Grace discovered a talent for music and spent hours at the piano that Preston bought for her birthday. Young Henry toddled after everyone, adored by his older siblings. Preston and Victoria sat on their porch one evening in the summer of 1892, watching the sun set over the ranch they had built together. Their children's voices drifted from inside the house, laughing and arguing in equal measure. Victoria leaned her head on Preston's shoulder, feeling peaceful and content. "You remember that day in the general store?" Preston asked. "When those men attacked you and tore off your veil?" "I remember. I was so angry. Not just because they were robbing Martha, but because they made you feel ashamed of something you should never have been ashamed of." "You saved me that day," Victoria said quietly. "Not just from them, but from myself, from the belief that I was unworthy of love because of my scars." "You were always worthy." He kissed the top of her head. "I just helped you see it. You did more than that. You gave me a life I never dreamed I could have, a home, a family, happiness, everything. You gave me those things too. Before you, I was just going through the motions, working the ranch because it was what my parents wanted but not really living. You made me whole, Victoria." She turned to kiss him properly, this man who had seen past her scars to the woman beneath, who had courted her with patience and married her with pride. After nearly 20 years together, she loved him more deeply than she had thought possible to love anyone. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges as years always do. Martha passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, and Victoria wept at her funeral, remembering the kindness the older woman had shown to a desperate, veiled stranger. Sarah's husband died of a heart attack, and she moved into a small cottage on the Xavier ranch, glad to be near family again. Thomas married at 22, a sweet young woman named Clara who came from a neighboring ranch. They built a house on the Xavier property, and Thomas took over more and more of the daily operations as Preston began to step back. Emma went to college in Kansas City to study teaching, and Grace married a banker from Independence who adored her quiet strength. Henry, the youngest, proved to have his father's ranching instincts and his mother's stubborn determination. He worked alongside Thomas, and the two brothers made a formidable team in managing the ever-growing operation. Victoria became a grandmother when Thomas and Clara had their first child, a girl they named Martha in honor of the woman who had brought Preston and Victoria together. Holding that tiny baby, seeing her son as a father, Victoria felt the circle of life complete itself in a profound way. Preston's hair went fully gray, then white, and his face became weathered and lined from decades working outdoors. But to Victoria, he was as handsome as he had been the first time she saw him walk into the general store. Her own face aged as well, the scars fading somewhat with time but never disappearing, and she found she didn't mind. They were part of her story, part of what had brought her to this life. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Preston took Victoria on a trip to Kansas City, their first real vacation in years. They stayed in a fine hotel, ate at elegant restaurants, attended the theater. But what Victoria remembered most was walking through the city streets with her hand in Preston's, her face unveiled, feeling proud of who she was and who they were together. As they grew older, they spent more time simply being together, sitting on the porch and watching their grandchildren play, taking slow rides around the ranch, reading together in the evenings. They had built something lasting, something real, and the satisfaction of that accomplishment was sweeter than any physical pleasure. Victoria never forgot the fear and shame she had felt when she first arrived in Independence, hiding behind a veil and believing herself unworthy of love. But she also never forgot the moment Preston had looked at her scarred face and said, "Beautiful," meaning it with everything he was. He had taught her that love sees deeper than skin, that true connection transcends physical appearance, that courage means trusting someone else with your most vulnerable self. Their story became something of a legend in Independence. The veiled woman and the rancher who loved her, who built a life and a family together, who proved that real love sees beyond the surface. Young couples would sometimes visit them, asking for advice on marriage and life, and Preston and Victoria would share their story gladly, hoping it might help others find the courage to be their authentic selves. When they reached their 40s together, both in their 60s and slowing down with age, they made the decision to formally hand over the ranch operations to Thomas and Henry. The two brothers ran things smoothly, implementing new ideas while respecting the foundation their parents had built. Preston and Victoria moved into a smaller house on the property, a cozy place with a garden and a view of the hills Preston loved so much. Victoria continued to sew, now making quilts for each of her grandchildren, pouring love into every stitch. Preston spent his days working in the garden, reading and teaching his grandchildren to ride. They had earned their rest, and they enjoyed it fully. On a crisp October evening in 1898, 25 years after they had met, Preston and Victoria sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Their grandchildren played in the yard, their own children gathered for Sunday dinner, and the ranch bustled with life and activity all around them. "Did you ever imagine this?" Preston asked, gesturing to the scene before them. "When you stepped off that stagecoach with your face hidden behind a veil?" "Never," Victoria admitted. "I thought my life was over. I thought I would spend the rest of my days alone, hidden, working just to survive. And instead I found everything I never knew I needed. Love, family, home, purpose." She squeezed his hand. "I found you. I'm the lucky one," Preston said. "You let me see the real you, trusted me with your heart. That's a gift I've never taken for granted." "We saved each other," Victoria said simply. As the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they sat together in comfortable silence, their hands intertwined, their lives deeply intertwined. Victoria's scars had faded with time but never disappeared, and she wore them now without shame, knowing they were part of the story that had brought her to this moment. The story of a woman who had hidden her face in fear, and a man who had asked to see the real her. The story of courage and trust, of love that looked deeper than scars, of two people who built a life together on a foundation of absolute acceptance. It was a story worth telling, a life worth living, and as Victoria sat there beside her husband, surrounded by family and love, she knew she would not change a single moment of it. Their legacy lived on through their children and grandchildren, through the ranch that bore the Xavier name, through the countless lives they had touched in Independence and beyond. But more than that, their legacy was the lesson they embodied. That true love sees beyond the surface, that everyone deserves acceptance and belonging, that courage means showing up as your authentic self even when it terrifies you. Years later, when both Preston and Victoria had passed peacefully from this world within months of each other, their family gathered to remember them. Thomas stood before the assembled crowd and told the story of how his parents had met, how his father had looked past his mother's scars to see her heart, how their love had built not just a ranch but an entire family legacy. "My father taught me that real strength is in gentleness," Thomas said. "That true vision is seeing what others overlook. My mother taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear but acting despite it. Together, they showed us all what love looks like when it's real and deep and true." The story of Victoria and Preston Xavier became part of Independence's history, passed down through generations. The ranch still stood, run now by their great-grandchildren, and in the small cemetery beside the church, their graves lay side by side beneath a shared headstone that read simply, "Together always." And in that small town in Missouri, whenever someone felt afraid or unworthy or certain that happiness was beyond their reach, there was always someone who remembered the story of the woman in the veil and the rancher who loved her, and who would say, "Don't give up. Love sees deeper than you think."